The Russo-Japanese War was one of the most significant events of the early 20th century. A series of defeats exposed all the shortcomings of the tsarist regime, and in its wake, the Entente was finally formed, and the world began to move slowly but surely toward World War I. In this video, we'll explore how this came to be and why Russia lost to Japan. By the start of the war with Japan, Russia had practically reached the zenith of its expansion. The Crimean War marked the limits of its advance in Europe. By 1890, after reaching the borders of Afghanistan and Persia, the potential for expansion in Central Asia had been exhausted. Further advancement threatened direct conflict with the British Empire. Russia then turned its attention to the east, where Qing China could no longer hold on to its northeastern territories. Weakened by crushing defeats in the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, China was forced to make concessions. The Treaty of Aigun, signed with China, formalized the transfer of what is now Primorsky Krai to Russia. In 1891, to develop these territories, construction began on the Trans-Siberian Railway, a railway line between Chelyabinsk and Vladivostok, approximately 7,000 kilometers long. The government understood that facilitating trade through the ports of the Yellow Sea could become an excellent source of revenue. Meanwhile, Japan carried out a series of reforms known as the Meiji Restoration. The new government finally abandoned its policy of self-isolation and set a course for the modernization of the country. Successes in the economy and the creation of a Western-style army and navy allowed Japan to begin considering foreign expansion. Its first target was, of course, Korea. Under no circumstances could control over Korea be allowed to pass to the Western powers. Therefore, as early as 1876, under Japanese military pressure, Korea signed a treaty with Japan that opened its ports to Japanese trade. This led to the Sino-Japanese War over control of the country. The enemy's navy and army were defeated in a very short time. On April 17th, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki, under which China renounced all rights to Korea and ceded the island of Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and the Idong Peninsula to Japan. The Europeans were alarmed by this turn of events. Russia, France, and Germany launched a tripartite intervention, demanding that Japan renounce its annexation of the Liaodong Peninsula. To confront all three of these countries at once would have been madness. The Russian government understood this perfectly and was able to take advantage of the situation. Russia and China signed a treaty under which Russia was granted a lease on the ice-free ports of the Liaodong Peninsula, Port Arthur and Dalny, and was permitted to build a railway to these ports. In effect, Russia simply seized this territory from Japan. Furthermore, Japan was forced to agree to the establishment of a joint Russian-Japanese protectorate over Korea. But in reality, Russia was the sole ruler on the Korean peninsula. Soon it would further strengthen its position when, as part of the suppression of the Hetuan uprising in China, the Eight-Nation Alliance occupied Manchuria. Meanwhile, in Japan, a change of cabinet took place, and an Anglo-Japanese treaty was concluded, which raised hopes that, in the event of war, no European power would dare to aid Russia for fear of being drawn into a war with Britain. The conflict was steadily approaching. In 1902, Russia signed an agreement with China under which it undertook to withdraw its troops from Manchuria. However, this condition was never fulfilled, which did not suit the Japanese government. In January 1904, Japan severed diplomatic relations with Russia and attacked warships off Port Arthur. This marked the beginning of the war. In May, the Japanese Second Army landed on the Liaodong Peninsula and advanced toward Port Arthur, establishing a bridgehead for the offensive. After a failed attempt to relieve the city, Russian troops withdrew to the town of Liuyan, where one of the war's most crucial battles took place. Although the Japanese army suffered a crushing defeat, its opponent was unable to capitalize on it. Russian commander Alexei Kuropatkin issued a completely absurd order to retreat. As the war progressed, his army would have several opportunities to deal Japan a decisive defeat, but each time Kuropatkin either retreated or delayed his actions, giving the enemy the time it needed. Later, the Russians retreated after the war's main battle near Mukden, China's largest city, having lost more than 8,000 men killed. Despite the fact that Japanese losses exceeded 15,000, nearly twice as many, the Russians surrendered one garrison after another, each with a month's supply of ammunition and provisions. Command issues were also evident in the Navy. Vice Admiral Stepan Makarov, who had distinguished himself in the war against the Turks, was also sent to the Russo-Japanese War. He led a squadron out to sea and conducted reconnaissance, but that was all he managed to do. Makarov was killed in the very first days of the war aboard the battleship Petropavlovsk, which struck a mine. Another major cause of the Russian defeat was logistical problems. By the start of the war, the Trans-Siberian Railway was already operational, but its capacity was only 3 to 4 train pairs per day. This made it impossible to quickly deploy reserves to the Far East. As a result, it took over a month to deploy a single army corps, numbering about 30,000 men. Consequently, by the time of the landing on the Liaodong Peninsula, the Russians had managed to complete the transport of their troops only partially, and their total strength stood at around 160,000 men. Even so, at the start of the war, the tsarist army was more than 3 times larger than the Japanese one. The problem was that these forces were also widely scattered geographically, from Chita to Vladivostok and from Blagoveshchensk to Port Arthur. Moreover, most of these troops were tied up guarding infrastructure and fortresses, which meant that no more than 60,000 men were directly available for active operations. At the start of the war, the Japanese had nearly twice as many warships, a number they increased by capturing Russian vessels. Often, after a battle, the Japanese would salvage and repair sunken Russian ships. For example, the cruiser Varyag, scuttled by its crew in the early days of the war, later served the enemy for 10 years under the name Soya. Furthermore, the Japanese fleet was far superior in quality. Its ships outperformed the Russian ones in virtually every respect: speed, range, armor, and so on. Even the Japanese had better ammunition, which also had a significant impact on the course of the fighting. Meanwhile, the international situation proved extremely unfavorable for Russia. The world powers were closely watching the conflict. While Germany declared its neutrality in the very first days, Great Britain and the United States, which had similar interests, jointly supported Japan. Their assistance was purely financial, but very important. They covered approximately 40% of the costs of the war with Russia, which, incidentally, received no aid from them. Although an alliance had been formed between Russia and France before the war, the latter declared its neutrality. As the war progressed, all the problems of the Russian army became apparent, so France decided to sign an agreement with England. However, despite Russia's financial aid and economic might, the resources of both countries were gradually being depleted. The Empire's state budget in 1903 amounted to 1.9 billion rubles in gold, while the cost of military operations totaled 2.6 billion rubles, and the damage caused by the war amounted to another 4 billion rubles in gold. A revolution broke out in the country, and the Russian command took no decisive action on the front. For their part, the Japanese, having suffered enormous losses, also remained inactive. The war was drawing to a close. Russia recognized Japan's right to rule Korea, ceded part of Sakhalin Island, and handed over the Kwantung Peninsula along with Port Arthur. No reparations were paid to anyone, but Russia was required to pay the enemy compensation for the maintenance of Russian prisoners of war. Ultimately, incompetent leadership and logistical problems deprived Russia of any chance of a military victory in the war, while financial aid from Great Britain and the United States to Japan deprived Russia of any chance of prolonging the war to wear Japan down. All these factors led to Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. See you soon.